On October 18th, 1983, at approximately 2:47 p.m., Dr. Michael Garrison was 37 minutes into a routine root canal procedure when he noticed something that would force him to choose between his Hippocratic oath and his duty to his country. The dental office occupied the second floor of a modest brick building in Arlington, Virginia, 3 blocks from the Clarendon Metro station, and 20 minutes by car from the heart of Washington, D.C. Michael had been practicing there since 1968, 15 years of cleanings and fillings and extractions, 15 years of building a reputation as a careful, methodical dentist who never rushed through a procedure and always returned patient phone calls the same day. The patient in the chair that afternoon was a man named Viktor Petrov, 48 years old according to the birth date listed in his file, though Michael had long suspected the information was approximate at best. Petrov had been coming to the practice for nearly 3 years, since January of 1981, always scheduling appointments with several weeks' notice, always paying in cash at the end of each visit, and always maintaining the pleasant but distant demeanor of someone who understood that small talk with one's dentist was expected but not particularly meaningful. He claimed to work as a technical translator at the Library of Congress, a job that seemed to involve irregular hours and frequent travel, based on the way his appointments were scattered across the calendar with no discernible pattern. Michael worked with steady hands, his fingers manipulating the endodontic files with the precision that came from decades of practice, clearing infected pulp from the root canal of Petrov's upper left first molar. The procedure was proceeding normally. Petrov reclined in the leather dental chair at a 45-degree angle, his mouth propped open by a rubber dam that isolated the tooth being treated, his eyes half closed in the resigned patience of someone enduring necessary discomfort. Linda Chen, Michael's dental assistant, stood to his left, adjusting the overhead light and passing him instruments from the tray with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked alongside him for 5 years and could anticipate his needs without verbal instruction. The jacket fell at 2:47 p.m., according to the clock mounted on the wall behind the reception desk, visible through the open doorway of the treatment room. Petrov had draped his dark wool overcoat across the chair near the window when he'd first entered, the chair where patients' family members sometimes sat during lengthy procedures, though Petrov always came alone. The coat had been hanging partially off the chair's armrest, and when Linda moved past it to retrieve additional gauze from the supply cabinet, her hip brushed against the fabric. The coat slid to the floor, landing with a muffled thump that was barely audible over the high-pitched whir of the dental drill Michael had just set down. Linda bent immediately to pick it up, her instinct to maintain the orderly appearance of the treatment room overriding any concern about interrupting the procedure. Michael glanced over, his hands still positioned near Petrov's open mouth, and watched as Linda lifted the coat. Something small and rectangular slipped from the inside pocket and fell onto the linoleum floor, landing face up. It was a notebook, perhaps 3 inches by 5 inches, bound in black leather with an elastic band meant to keep it closed. The band had come loose in the fall, and the notebook had opened to a page somewhere near its middle. Linda froze, her hand halfway to retrieving the notebook, her body blocking Petrov's view from where he lay, reclined in the chair. Michael saw her eyes widen, saw her glance up at him with an expression he would later describe as pure instinctive alarm. The look of someone who has stumbled upon something they immediately recognize as dangerous, even before their conscious mind has fully processed why. Michael's gaze dropped to the notebook, to the page visible from where he stood 7 feet away, and even at that distance he could see that it was covered in neat columns of numbers, interspersed with notations in what appeared to be Cyrillic script. The page was divided into rows, each one starting with a date, followed by abbreviations he didn't recognize, followed by sequences of digits that seemed too structured to be random. Petrov lay motionless in the chair, his mouth still propped open with the rubber dam, his view blocked by Michael's body and by the angle of the reclined chair which pointed his gaze toward the ceiling, rather than toward the floor where Linda knelt. Michael's hands, which had been steady for 37 minutes of delicate work inside the infected root canal, began to tremble slightly. He was a veteran of the Korean War, had served as a medic with the 8th Army from 1951 to 1953, and he had been briefed during his service about Soviet intelligence activities, about how their officers operated in civilian spaces, about the methods they used to gather and transmit information. He had been 20 years old then, and the briefings had seemed abstract, the stuff of spy novels rather than anything he would encounter in his actual life as a dentist in suburban Virginia 30 years later. Linda's eyes met his again, a silent question passing between them, and Michael gave the smallest shake of his head, a gesture so subtle that Petrov, if he had been watching, might have mistaken it for nothing more than a momentary tremor. Linda understood. She carefully closed the notebook, fastened the elastic band, and slipped it back into the coat pocket where it had come from. She hung the coat back on the chair, smoothing the fabric, and returned to her position beside the dental chair with movements that appeared calm, but which Michael knew concealed the same racing pulse he felt in his own chest. Michael had 23 minutes remaining in the procedure, 23 minutes during which he would need to maintain absolute composure while working with sharp instruments in close proximity to a man who might be exactly what that notebook suggested he was. His mind raced through possibilities, through explanations that might be innocent, but the numbers and the Cyrillic text and the systematic organization of the entries kept pulling his thoughts back to the briefings he'd received in Korea, to warnings about how intelligence officers disguised themselves as ordinary professionals, how they built cover identities that could withstand casual scrutiny, how they moved through American society gathering information that would be transmitted back to Moscow through methods that remained invisible to everyone, except those trained to look for them. Viktor Petrov lay vulnerable in his chair, trusting Michael with drills and files and the intimate access that dental work required, and Michael continued the procedure with hands that shook just slightly, wondering what kind of man he was going to have to become. Michael completed the root canal at 3:24 p.m., his hands moving through the final steps with mechanical precision while his mind remained fixed on the notebook he had seen fall from Petrov's coat pocket 37 minutes earlier. He sealed the canal with gutta percha, placed a temporary filling, and gave Petrov the standard post-procedure instructions about avoiding hard foods for the next 48 hours and calling immediately if he experienced severe pain or swelling. Petrov nodded, accepted the prescription for antibiotics that Michael wrote out in handwriting that looked steadier than it felt, and paid his bill at the front desk with 6 crisp $20 bills counted out from a leather wallet. He scheduled a follow-up appointment for November 3rd to check the healing progress, shook Michael's hand with a grip that felt neither stronger nor weaker than usual, and walked out into the October afternoon carrying secrets that Michael could only begin to guess at. The moment the door closed behind Petrov, Linda turned to Michael with eyes that had been holding back questions for the better part of an hour. They stood in the treatment room with the afternoon sun slanting through the Venetian blinds, casting bars of light across the dental chair where Petrov had been sitting minutes before, and Michael found himself unable to form words that would adequately capture what they had witnessed. Linda spoke first, her voice low, despite the fact that they were alone in the office, the last appointment of the day having just departed. She told him that this wasn't the first time she had noticed something unusual about Petrov. He always paid in cash, which wasn't unprecedented but was increasingly rare in 1983 when most patients used checks or credit cards. He never provided a home phone number, only a work number that rang to what sounded like a switchboard where messages could be left but never returned directly. His address on file was a post office box in Georgetown rather than a street address, which the office had accepted because he had seemed like a legitimate patient in every other respect, and because Michael had never been one to turn away someone who needed dental care simply because their paperwork was incomplete. Michael stayed late at the office that evening after Linda left at 6, sitting at his desk with Petrov's patient file spread open in front of him. The file was thin, containing only the most basic information: name, birth date, occupation, the P.O. box address, and the work phone number that connected to the Library of Congress switchboard. 3 years of appointment records showed a pattern that Michael had never consciously noticed before, but which now seemed glaringly significant. Petrov's visits clustered around the beginning and middle of each month, always on Tuesday or Thursday afternoons, always between 2 and 4 o'clock, with gaps of 6 to 8 weeks between appointments that suggested either remarkably good dental hygiene or a schedule that was governed by something other than actual oral health needs. Michael drove home at 7:30, his mind cycling through the same questions that had been repeating since the moment he saw the notebook fall. His house in McLean sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a split-level colonial that he and his wife Sarah had purchased in 1969, the year after they married. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he arrived, and their 2 sons, David and James, were upstairs doing homework or pretending to do homework while actually listening to music on headphones. Michael kissed Sarah hello, and she immediately asked what was wrong, her ability to read his mood after 14 years of marriage more accurate than he sometimes found comfortable. He told her he'd had a difficult day, a complicated procedure that had taken longer than expected, which was true in a technical sense even if it omitted the substance of what was actually troubling him. Sarah accepted this explanation with the understanding that sometimes dental work was stressful and that Michael occasionally needed an evening to decompress. They ate dinner as a family, pot roast and potatoes and green beans, and Michael participated in the conversation about David's upcoming college applications and James's frustration with his algebra teacher. But part of his attention remained fixed on the image of that notebook page, on the columns of numbers and Cyrillic notations that suggested purposes far removed from the work of a Library of Congress translator. That night, lying awake while Sarah slept beside him, Michael thought about his service in Korea 30 years earlier. He had been a young medic then, idealistic and terrified in roughly equal measure, treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals while American and Soviet proxy forces fought for control of a peninsula that most Americans couldn't have located on a map before 1950. The briefings about Soviet intelligence activities had been delivered by officers who seemed impossibly old to his 20-year-old self. Men who warned them that the enemy wasn't just the soldiers they could see across the battlefield, but also the intelligence officers who moved invisibly through civilian populations, gathering information that would be used to undermine American security in ways that wouldn't become apparent until years or decades later. Michael rose at 5:30 the next morning, October 19th, and drove to the Arlington Public Library before work. He spent an hour in the reading room going through back issues of the Washington Post, searching for articles about Soviet espionage activities in the Washington area. What he found was simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. There had been numerous cases over the past decade, defense contractors who had sold technical specifications to Soviet handlers, government employees who had photographed classified documents in exchange for cash payments, civilians who had been recruited through appeals to ideology or exploited through blackmail or financial desperation. The methods varied, but certain patterns emerged: the use of dead drops to transfer information without face-to-face contact, the establishment of legitimate cover identities that could withstand surface-level scrutiny, the preference for cash payments that left no paper trail. the systematic nature of information gathering that accumulated over months or years into comprehensive intelligence portraits. Michael returned to his office and saw patients throughout the morning, performing routine cleanings and filling cavities while his thoughts remained partially elsewhere. During his lunch break, he sat in his private office and reviewed Petrov's appointment history again, this time cross-referencing the dates with news events he remembered or could look up. Petrov had come in for an emergency visit in June of 1982, 2 days before President Reagan's speech at the United Nations about arms control. He had scheduled a cleaning in March of 1983, the week after Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative announcement. The correlations might have been coincidental, but Michael had stopped believing in coincidence somewhere around 3 o'clock the previous afternoon. By October 25th, Michael had made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. He could not go to the FBI based solely on having seen a notebook fall from a patient's coat pocket. Patient confidentiality was not just a professional guideline, but an ethical obligation that he had spent 15 years honoring. What happened in his treatment room was meant to stay confidential, unless there was clear evidence of ongoing harm to others, and a notebook with numbers and Cyrillic script, however suspicious, did not constitute that clear evidence. But Petrov had a follow-up appointment scheduled for November 3rd, and if Michael could gather additional evidence during that visit, evidence that moved beyond suspicious to definitive, then he would have grounds to contact federal authorities without feeling that he had violated the fundamental trust that made his profession possible. He discussed his plan with Linda on the afternoon of October 26th, speaking in vague terms at first, watching her face to gauge whether she understood what he was proposing. Linda had emigrated from Taiwan in 1974, had built a life in America through careful work and persistent effort, and she had no romanticized notions about the nature of authoritarian governments or the intelligence services they employed. When Michael finally asked directly whether she would be willing to help him observe Petrov more carefully during the November appointment, to position herself where she might see what Petrov carried or notice details that Michael might miss while performing the actual dental work, Linda was quiet for nearly a minute before nodding. She told him she was frightened, that this felt dangerous in ways she couldn't fully articulate, but that she trusted his judgment and understood why this mattered. Michael spent the last week of October in a state of persistent distraction that affected both his professional work and his home life. Sarah noticed that he seemed preoccupied, that he was drinking an extra glass of wine with dinner, and staying up late reading in his study instead of coming to bed at his usual hour. His sons noticed that he seemed less interested in their daily reports from school, that he responded to their questions with distracted affirmations that suggested he hadn't quite heard what they'd said. Other patients noticed that Dr. Garrison seemed unusually quiet during their appointments, less inclined toward the gentle small talk that normally made his treatment room feel comfortable rather than clinical. On the evening of November 2nd, Michael sat alone in his home office after Sarah and the boys had gone to bed. On his desk lay Petrov's patient file, his notes from the library research about Soviet espionage patterns, and a slip of paper on which he had written the phone number for the FBI's Washington field office, copied from the phone book that afternoon. He had not yet decided whether he would actually call that number, whether the evidence he hoped to gather during tomorrow's appointment would be sufficient to justify breaking patient confidentiality, whether his suspicions about Viktor Petrov were substantial enough to warrant transforming his dental practice into a site of federal investigation. But he knew that tomorrow would require a decision, that Viktor Petrov would return to his office expecting routine follow-up care, and would sit in the dental chair trusting Michael to examine his healing root canal with the same professional detachment he had shown for 3 years. Michael wondered whether that trust was itself a form of tradecraft, whether Petrov had chosen him as his dentist precisely because dentists were taught never to question their patients' lives beyond what was medically relevant, whether the dental chair represented a zone of safety that intelligence officers could exploit because medical professionals were trained to look only at teeth and gums and never at the secrets hidden in coat pockets. Tomorrow he would have to decide what kind of man he was going to be, what kind of dentist, and whether the oath he had taken to do no harm extended to protecting a man who might be harming his country in ways that would only become visible years after the damage had already been done. Michael arrived at his office at 7:30 on the morning of November 3rd, 90 minutes before his first scheduled patient and 4.5 hours before Viktor Petrov's 2 o'clock appointment. He unlocked the door and stood for a moment in the waiting room, looking at the chairs where patients sat reading magazines, at the reception desk where Linda checked people in and collected payments, at the hallway leading back to the treatment rooms where he spent his days looking into people's mouths and trying to fix what was broken or infected or decaying. The office felt different that morning, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights humming overhead or the faint antiseptic smell that never quite left the air, no matter how thoroughly they cleaned at the end of each day. Linda arrived at 8, and they discussed their plan in the small break room where they normally ate lunch and stored their coats. Michael had brought a camera from home, a Canon Sure Shot that he used for family vacations and birthday parties, and he placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk where he could reach it quickly if the opportunity presented itself. Linda would position herself near the chair where Petrov typically draped his coat, organizing supplies or wiping down surfaces, staying close enough to observe without appearing to pay particular attention. They would look for the notebook again, for any other items that might confirm or disprove Michael's suspicions, and if they found evidence that seemed definitive, Michael would photograph it. The plan felt simultaneously too simple and impossibly complicated, the kind of amateur surveillance that would seem absurd if described to someone else, but which felt like the only available option given the constraints they were operating under. The morning patients came and went. Michael cleaned Mrs. Henderson's teeth at 9 o'clock and filled a cavity for Mr. Peterson at 10:30. He saw a new patient at 11:15, a young woman named Rebecca Simmons who had recently moved to the area and needed a comprehensive examination. He performed each procedure with the careful attention that his reputation depended on, but part of his mind remained fixed on the 2 o'clock appointment, on what he might discover and what he would do with that discovery once he had it. His hands moved through the familiar motions while his thoughts circled endlessly around questions of duty and ethics and the line between legitimate concern and paranoid overreach. Petrov arrived at 2:03 p.m., apologizing for being a few minutes late and explaining that traffic on Wilson Boulevard had been heavier than expected. He wore a dark gray suit and a blue tie, dressed as though he had come from work or was planning to return there after his appointment, and he carried the same wool overcoat that he had worn during his previous visit 3 weeks earlier. Michael shook his hand and led him back to the treatment room, maintaining the pleasant professional demeanor that he had cultivated over 15 years of practice, giving no indication that anything had changed since their last interaction. Petrov settled into the dental chair and removed his coat, draping it over the chair near the window exactly as he had done on October 18th. Linda was already in the room, arranging instruments on the tray beside the dental chair, and she positioned herself at an angle that gave her a clear view of both Petrov and his coat. Michael washed his hands at the small sink in the corner, put on a fresh pair of latex gloves, and adjusted the overhead light so that it illuminated Petrov's mouth. He asked Petrov how the tooth had been feeling over the past 3 weeks, whether there had been any pain or sensitivity or swelling, and Petrov reported that everything had healed well, that he had followed all the post-procedure instructions and had experienced no complications. Michael began the examination, using a small mirror and a metal probe to check the tooth where he had performed the root canal. The temporary filling was intact, and the surrounding gum tissue showed no signs of infection or inflammation. He took his time, moving the mirror carefully, asking Petrov to bite down and release, checking the alignment and making sure that the sealed root canal was healing properly. Petrov lay back in the chair with his mouth open, his eyes half closed, trusting Michael completely in the way that patients do when they have no reason to suspect that their dentist is anything other than what he appears to be. At 2:17 p.m., the pager clipped to Petrov's belt began beeping, a high-pitched sound that cut through the quiet hum of the overhead light and the soft classical music playing from the radio on the counter. Petrov's eyes opened, and he made a muffled sound that indicated he needed Michael to remove the instruments from his mouth. Michael stepped back, and Petrov sat up, reaching for the pager and checking the number displayed on its small screen. He looked at Michael with an expression that mixed apology and urgency, and said that he needed to make a phone call, that there was an emergency at work that required his immediate attention. Michael gestured toward the hallway and told Petrov he could use the phone at the reception desk, and Petrov stood quickly and walked out of the treatment room, leaving his coat draped over the chair. Michael and Linda were alone. They could hear Petrov's voice in the hallway, speaking in what Linda immediately recognized as Russian, the words rapid and intense, in a way that suggested genuine stress rather than casual conversation. Michael looked at Linda, and she looked back at him, and in that moment they both understood that they had perhaps 2 minutes, maybe 3 if they were lucky, before Petrov finished his call and returned. Linda moved first, crossing to the chair where the coat lay, and reaching carefully into the inside pocket. She pulled out the black leather notebook and handed it to Michael, who opened it with hands that were shaking badly enough that he had to grip the edges firmly to keep the pages steady. The notebook contained exactly what Michael had feared and expected. Pages filled with dates and abbreviated codes and columns of numbers that followed patterns too systematic to be anything innocent. Names written in margins, some of them names that Michael recognized from news reports about Department of Defense officials and defense contractors. Technical terms that meant nothing to Michael, but which clearly meant something to whoever had compiled this information. Locations listed with times, meeting places or dead drop sites or surveillance points. The handwriting was precise and careful, the work of someone who understood that these records represented valuable intelligence that needed to be preserved accurately. Michael heard Petrov's voice still speaking Russian in the hallway, the tone remaining urgent, and he made a decision that felt less like choosing and more like falling. He retrieved the camera from his desk drawer and began photographing the notebook pages, his hands steadying now that he was committed to action, the viewfinder framing each page as he pressed the shutter button. He photographed 5 pages in rapid succession, the flash firing each time, the mechanical click of the camera impossibly loud in the small treatment room. Linda stood at the doorway watching the hallway, her body tense, ready to warn Michael if Petrov started walking back toward them. Michael also found a second identification card in the coat's outer pocket, a Library of Congress employee badge that looked authentic, but which bore a different name than the one in Petrov's patient file. The badge identified the bearer as Gregory Walsh, Technical Services Division, with a photograph that was unmistakably Petrov's face. Michael photographed the badge, returned it to the pocket exactly as he had found it, and handed the notebook back to Linda. She replaced it in the inside pocket, smoothed the coat's fabric, and stepped away from the chair just as Petrov's voice in the hallway shifted tone, the Russian words giving way to English as he apparently concluded his call. Petrov returned to the treatment room at 2:21 p.m., apologizing again for the interruption and explaining that there had been a crisis with a translation project that needed his immediate input. Michael told him it was no problem, that these things happened, and gestured for Petrov to return to the dental chair. Petrov settled back into position, opened his mouth, and Michael resumed the examination as though nothing had changed, as though he hadn't just spent the last 4 minutes photographing evidence that the man in his chair was living under at least 2 different identities and keeping detailed records of what appeared to be systematic intelligence collection. Michael's hands moved through the remaining steps of the follow-up examination, checking the bite alignment, and explaining that the temporary filling could be replaced with a permanent crown in another few weeks. He scheduled Petrov's next appointment for early January, a routine cleaning that would maintain the pattern they had established over 3 years of seemingly normal dentist-patient interactions. Petrov left the office at 2:31 p.m., paying his bill with cash as always, thanking Michael for accommodating the interruption, and walking out into the November afternoon with no apparent awareness that anything unusual had occurred. Michael and Linda stood in the treatment room after he left, neither of them speaking, the camera with its 5 exposed frames sitting in Michael's desk drawer like evidence at a crime scene. That evening, Michael would take the film to a 1-hour Photoshop in Tyson's Corner, paying cash and giving a name that wasn't his own, and when he picked up the developed prints an hour later, what he saw in those images would eliminate any remaining possibility that Viktor Petrov was simply a translator who happened to keep notes in Russian and carry identification documents under multiple names. The photographs showed a level of detail and organization that could only belong to someone engaged in professional intelligence work, and Michael understood as he looked at those images that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, that he had used his patient's trust and vulnerability to gather evidence that would destroy that patient's life, and that the only question remaining was whether he possessed the courage or the foolishness to follow through on what he had discovered. Michael drove to Tyson's Corner immediately after his last patient left at 5:30, the undeveloped film from the Canon Sure Shot sitting in his jacket pocket like contraband. He found a 1-hour Photoshop in a strip mall near the highway, a place he had never been before, and would likely never visit again, and he paid cash for express processing using a name he invented on the spot. The clerk, a teenage boy who seemed more interested in the magazine he'd been reading than in his customers, barely looked at Michael as he wrote out the receipt and promised the prints would be ready by 6:30. Michael killed the hour, driving aimlessly through the suburbs, his mind unable to settle on anything except what those photographs might reveal once they were developed and printed on paper that he could hold in his hands. He picked up the envelope at 6:27 and waited until he was back in his car, parked in a dark corner of the lot, before opening it. The prints were standard size, 4 inches by 6 inches, and the 5 images he had captured showed exactly what he had seen through the camera's viewfinder that afternoon in his treatment room. The notebook pages were clearly visible, the dates and codes and abbreviated entries legible even in the small format. One page showed a list of names that Michael recognized from newspaper articles about Defense Department officials. Another contained what appeared to be meeting times and locations, coordinates marked with precision that suggested operational planning rather than casual note-taking. A third page displayed technical terminology that Michael didn't understand but which clearly related to weapons systems or intelligence gathering capabilities. The photograph of the false identification card showed Viktor Petrov's face attached to the name Gregory Walsh, the Library of Congress badge looking entirely authentic, except for the fact that it belonged to someone who was simultaneously living as Viktor Petrov, patient at Dr. Michael Garrison's dental practice. Michael sat in his car looking at the photographs under the dome light for nearly 20 minutes before starting the engine and driving home. Sarah was in the kitchen when he arrived, preparing dinner while their sons did homework upstairs, and Michael walked past her without speaking and went directly to his study on the first floor. He closed the door, spread the 5 photographs across his desk, and stared at them until the images seemed to blur together into a single accusation. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and retrieved a leather-bound journal that he had been keeping sporadically since his medical service in Korea, a place where he recorded thoughts that seemed too complex or troubling to speak aloud, and he wrote in careful handwriting that betrayed none of the turmoil he felt inside. He wrote that he had taken an oath when he entered dental school, a version of the Hippocratic oath adapted for his profession, promising to do no harm and to maintain patient confidentiality except in cases where silence would enable ongoing harm to others. He wrote that Viktor Petrov had trusted him with access to his body, had sat in the dental chair with his mouth open and his defenses down, had allowed Michael to work with sharp instruments in proximity to vulnerable tissue, and that this trust was the foundation of everything that made medical practice possible. He wrote that he was contemplating using that trust as a weapon, that he was considering taking the evidence he had gathered through exploitation of Petrov's vulnerability and delivering it to federal authorities who would use it to arrest and prosecute and imprison a man who had done nothing during his dental appointments except be a patient seeking care. But Michael also wrote that the notebook pages suggested Petrov had been systematically collecting information about American defense capabilities, that the false identification indicated deception at a level that went far beyond simple privacy concerns, and that the names and locations and technical specifications visible in those photographs represented intelligence that could be used to harm American interests or endanger American lives. He wrote that he didn't know how many people might already have been compromised by whatever information Petrov had gathered and transmitted, and that he didn't know how many more might be harmed if Petrov continued his work undetected and unreported. Sarah knocked on the study door at 7:15 and asked if everything was all right, and when Michael opened the door she saw the photographs spread across his desk before he could gather them up. She asked what they were, and Michael found that he could no longer maintain the fiction that nothing unusual was happening, that his distraction over the past weeks was simply work-related stress. He told her to close the door, and he explained everything, starting with the notebook falling from Petrov's coat on October 18th and ending with the photographs he had taken that afternoon. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression moving from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like fear. When he finished, Sarah asked what he planned to do, and Michael admitted that he didn't know. Sarah sat down in the leather chair across from his desk and was quiet for nearly a minute before speaking. She said that if Petrov was actually a Soviet intelligence officer, then reporting him was clearly the right thing to do, but she also said that she was terrified of what might happen to their family if Michael became involved in an espionage investigation. She asked whether the Soviets might retaliate, whether Michael might be called to testify at a trial, whether their sons might be questioned or followed or put at risk. She asked whether Michael had considered that he might be wrong, that there might be an innocent explanation for the notebook and the false identification, and Michael showed her the photographs again and asked her to look carefully at what they showed. Sarah looked at the images for a long time before acknowledging that there was no innocent explanation for what appeared in those photographs. She asked what patient confidentiality meant if it protected someone who was actively harming the country, and Michael said that was exactly the question he had been struggling with for more than 2 weeks. They talked until nearly 9 o'clock, their dinner growing cold on the table downstairs, their sons eventually giving up on waiting and making sandwiches for themselves. Sarah finally said that she would support whatever decision Michael made, but that he needed to make it soon, that the uncertainty was becoming its own kind of poison, and that their family couldn't function indefinitely under the weight of this secret. Michael spent the next week, from November 4th through November 10th, researching espionage cases and trying to understand what his legal and ethical obligations actually were. He called the American Dental Association's ethics hotline from a payphone in Alexandria, presenting the situation as a hypothetical scenario involving a dentist who had accidentally discovered evidence that a patient might be involved in criminal activity. The ethics counselor he spoke with explained that patient confidentiality was not absolute, that it could be breached in cases involving serious crimes that posed ongoing danger to others, but that the definition of what constituted sufficient justification for breach of confidentiality was subject to interpretation and would ultimately depend on the specific circumstances and the severity of the potential harm. The answer provided no clarity because the situation Michael faced didn't fit neatly into any category the ethics counselor described. Espionage was certainly a serious crime, but it wasn't the kind of immediate physical danger that would clearly justify breaking confidentiality. Petrov hadn't threatened anyone in Michael's presence, hadn't disclosed plans to harm specific individuals, hadn't done anything during his dental appointments except be a patient. The evidence Michael had gathered came entirely from opportunistic observation of items that Petrov had brought with him to appointments, items that Petrov had assumed would remain private, because the dental office was supposed to be a place where privacy was respected and protected. On November 13th, Linda came to Michael's office after the last patient had left and told him that she couldn't continue pretending everything was normal. She said she had been having nightmares about men following her home from work, about Soviet agents discovering that she had been involved in photographing Petrov's notebook, about violence that might be directed at her or her family if Petrov's organization learned what they had done. She said that Michael needed to either report what they had discovered or destroy the photographs and forget they had ever seen anything, but that she couldn't exist indefinitely in this state of suspended tension where every appointment felt dangerous and every unexpected phone call felt like a threat. Michael understood what Linda was telling him, that his indecision was affecting not just his own life, but the life of someone who had trusted him and who had helped him because she believed he was doing something important. He promised her that he would make a decision within the week, that he wouldn't ask her to carry this burden any longer. And after she left, he sat alone in his office looking at Viktor Petrov's patient file and thinking about the appointment Petrov had scheduled for early January, the routine cleaning that would continue the pattern of normal dentist-patient interaction that had been established over 3 years. On November 16th, a Wednesday, Michael received a Christmas card in the mail at his office. It had been sent early, the kind of card that people mail in mid-November to ensure it arrives well before the holiday, and when Michael opened it he found a generic message about peace and goodwill, along with a handwritten note from Viktor Petrov, thanking him for his excellent care over the years and wishing him and his family a joyous holiday season. The handwriting was neat and careful, the same handwriting Michael had seen in the photographed notebook pages, and the gesture of sending a card to one's dentist was the kind of thing that a genuinely appreciative patient might do, or that a skilled intelligence officer maintaining a cover identity might do to reinforce the appearance of being exactly what he claimed to be. Michael looked at the card for a long time, at Petrov's signature at the bottom and the return address that listed the same P.O. box that was in his patient file, and he thought about the fact that this man sat in his dental chair trusting him completely, while simultaneously living a life built on deception and exploitation of exactly that kind of trust. The normalcy of the Christmas card, the pleasantness of the message, the careful maintenance of the dentist-patient relationship even as Petrov gathered intelligence that would be transmitted to handlers in Moscow, all of it crystallized into a clarity that Michael had been avoiding for weeks. Viktor Petrov was not primarily a patient who happened to be a spy. He was a spy who used his role as a patient as part of his operational security, and the dental office was not a sacred space that Petrov had violated with his espionage, but rather a tool that Petrov had deliberately selected and cultivated, because dentists were trained never to look beyond the teeth and gums into the lives their patients led outside the treatment room. Michael picked up the phone on his desk at 9:47 a.m. on November 17th and dialed the number for the FBI Washington field office that he had copied from the phone book weeks earlier. A receptionist answered, and Michael identified himself as a dentist with information about possible espionage activity. And after a brief hold, he was transferred to Special Agent Catherine Morrison in the Counterintelligence Division. Michael began by saying that he had a patient, that he believed this patient was a Soviet intelligence officer, and that he had evidence to support that belief. Agent Morrison asked him to hold while she prepared to record the conversation, and in the silence that followed, Michael understood that he had crossed the line he had been approaching for a month, that he had chosen his country over his patient, and that regardless of whether this decision was right or wrong in some absolute sense, he would spend the rest of his life questioning whether the man he had become in making it was the man he wanted to be. Michael met with FBI agents at a diner in Fairfax on the morning of November 18th, a neutral location far enough from his office that no one would recognize him, but public enough that the meeting would appear innocent to any surveillance that might already be watching him. Special Agent Catherine Morrison arrived at 9 o'clock, accompanied by Agent David Chen, and they took a booth in the back corner where their conversation would be masked by the ambient noise of breakfast orders being called from the kitchen and coffee cups clattering against saucers. Michael spread the 5 photographs across the table and explained how he had obtained them, and Morrison studied each image with an intensity that made clear she understood immediately what she was looking at. She told Michael that the FBI had been investigating possible intelligence leaks from the Library of Congress for nearly 8 months, but had been unable to identify the specific individual responsible. The photographs Michael had taken provided the connection they needed, and Agent Chen examined the notebook pages and said quietly that the coding system and organizational structure visible in the images matched patterns associated with Soviet military intelligence operations. Morrison explained what would happen next. The FBI would establish surveillance on Viktor Petrov's movements and begin building a comprehensive case that could support federal charges. They would monitor his contacts, identify his handlers, and document the full scope of his intelligence-gathering activities. But they needed Michael's cooperation to continue. They needed him to maintain his relationship with Petrov exactly as it had existed before, treating him as a normal patient and giving no indication that anything had changed. Petrov had an appointment scheduled for early January, and that appointment would be critical, an opportunity to observe him in a controlled environment and possibly to install surveillance equipment that would help track his activities outside the dental office. Michael felt something collapse inside him as Morrison outlined the plan. He had imagined that reporting Petrov would end his involvement, that he would hand over the photographs and the FBI would take responsibility from that point forward. But Morrison was telling him that his involvement was just beginning, that he would need to continue seeing Petrov as a patient while knowing that federal agents were watching through hidden cameras and listening through concealed microphones. She was asking him to transform his practice into a stage where he would perform the role of unsuspecting dentist, while Petrov performed the role of innocent patient, both of them maintaining a fiction that neither believed, but that operational security required them to sustain. Michael asked what would happen if he refused, if he simply told Petrov that he was retiring or closing his practice or no longer taking new patients, and Morrison explained gently but firmly that such an action would likely alert Petrov that something had changed, that it would compromise an investigation that could prevent significant intelligence losses and potentially save lives. She reminded Michael that Petrov's notebook had contained names of Department of Defense employees who might already be compromised or under pressure, that the technical specifications visible in the photographs related to weapons systems and satellite capabilities that were supposed to be among America's most closely guarded secrets. She said that Michael had already made the difficult choice to report what he had discovered, and that following through on that choice meant accepting responsibilities that extended beyond simply making a phone call. Michael agreed because he couldn't see how to refuse without becoming complicit in allowing Petrov's espionage to continue. And over the next 3 weeks he received regular briefings from Morrison about what the FBI surveillance was revealing. They had identified Petrov's apartment in Georgetown, a modest one-bedroom unit that he rented under the name Gregory Walsh. They had confirmed that while he did maintain an office at the Library of Congress, his actual work there was minimal and appeared to serve primarily as cover for his intelligence activities. They had observed him making contact with at least 2 other individuals who were suspected of being Soviet intelligence officers or assets, meetings that occurred in public places using techniques designed to avoid detection by anyone who might be watching. The surveillance also revealed that Petrov's operational schedule was more extensive than the notebook pages had suggested. He was meeting with sources throughout the Washington area, collecting information from defense contractors and government employees who had been recruited or compromised through methods the FBI was still working to understand fully. The investigation had expanded beyond Petrov himself to encompass an entire network of intelligence gathering that had been operating successfully for years, and Michael's dental office represented just one small piece of a much larger operational infrastructure. On the night of November 24th, FBI technicians entered Michael's office through the back door that Morrison had asked him to leave unlocked. They installed miniature cameras in the ceiling tiles of the treatment room and planted listening devices in the ventilation system, equipment so small and well concealed that even Michael had difficulty seeing it when he looked for it the next morning. The office that had been his professional home for 15 years now felt contaminated, transformed into something that served purposes far removed from dental care. Every patient who walked through the door from that point forward was potentially being recorded without their knowledge or consent, their conversations captured by equipment that existed solely to gather evidence against Viktor Petrov. Michael's other patients began noticing changes in his demeanor that he couldn't fully conceal. Mrs. Henderson, who had been coming to him for cleanings twice a year since 1970, asked during her December appointment whether everything was all right at home, whether his sons were doing well, whether the stress she detected in his face came from family problems or health concerns. Michael assured her that everything was fine, that he was simply tired from the busy holiday season, but he could see that she didn't quite believe him. Other patients made similar observations, commenting that Dr. Garrison seemed distracted or preoccupied, that he seemed less present during appointments than they remembered from previous visits. Linda's fear intensified as the January appointment approached. She confided in Michael that she had started taking different routes home from work each evening, that she checked her rearview mirror constantly for signs of being followed, that she had asked her husband to install additional locks on their doors and windows. The paranoia that had been theoretical in November had become visceral and consuming by December, and Michael understood that his decision to involve the FBI had placed Linda in a position where she felt perpetually unsafe in ways that no amount of reassurance could fully address. Sarah's concerns focused on their sons and on the possibility that Michael's involvement in the investigation might somehow put David and James at risk. She asked repeatedly whether the FBI had considered what would happen if Petrov's organization discovered that Michael had reported him, whether Soviet intelligence might retaliate against his family, whether there were security measures they should be taking. Morrison had assured Michael that the FBI would monitor for any threats and would provide protection if necessary, but Sarah found these assurances inadequate, given that the federal government was asking her husband to continue treating a suspected Soviet spy as though nothing had changed. Michael himself was drinking more heavily than he had in years, a glass of whiskey before dinner and another before bed, using alcohol to quiet the thoughts that circled endlessly through his mind during the hours when he should have been sleeping. He would lie awake thinking about the January appointment, about Viktor Petrov sitting in the dental chair with his mouth open and his guard down, while FBI agents watched through hidden cameras and recorded every word spoken. He thought about the fundamental betrayal that arrangement represented, the exploitation of trust and vulnerability that made it possible, and he wondered whether the intelligence value of the operation could possibly justify the moral cost of executing it. On December 9th, Morrison called to inform Michael that intercepted communication suggested Petrov was planning something significant in early January, that his appointment at the dental office might serve as cover for a meeting or a dead drop or some other operational activity. She told Michael that the January 14th appointment had become even more critical than they had initially anticipated, that it might represent an opportunity to observe Petrov making contact with sources or handlers in ways that would provide evidence sufficient to support immediate arrest and prosecution. Michael listened to this information and understood that his dental office had fully transformed from a place of healing into an instrument of counterintelligence operations, and that the man he had been when Viktor Petrov first became his patient in January 1981 no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Michael sat alone in his darkened office on the evening of December 9th after all his patients had left and all his staff had gone home. He looked at the dental chair where Petrov would sit in 5 weeks, at the overhead light that would illuminate Petrov's open mouth, at the instruments he would use to clean Petrov's teeth while federal agents recorded everything. He opened his journal and wrote that he used to believe his profession was sacred, that the dental chair represented a space of trust where patients could be vulnerable without fear of that vulnerability being exploited. He wrote that he now understood the chair was simply furniture, that the sacred space had never existed except in his own idealized conception of what his work meant, and that perhaps dentistry had always been just another ordinary profession, conducted by ordinary people who sometimes faced situations that demanded choices between competing obligations they had never expected to reconcile. He wrote that Viktor Petrov would arrive in January expecting routine care, and that Michael would provide that care while simultaneously facilitating Petrov's arrest, and that both men would be performing roles in a script that neither had written, but that circumstances had required them to execute. He wrote that he had made his choice and would follow through on it, but that following through felt less like courage and more like a kind of slow drowning, where the water rose incrementally until breathing became impossible, and the only option was to stop struggling and accept whatever came next. January 14th, 1984, arrived with the kind of cold clarity that comes from winter mornings in Northern Virginia, the temperature hovering just above freezing, and the sky a pale blue that seemed scrubbed clean of clouds. Michael arrived at his office at 1:47 in the afternoon, 73 minutes before Viktor Petrov's scheduled 2 o'clock appointment, and found FBI agents already positioned in the surveillance van across the street, and Special Agent Morrison sitting in the waiting room, disguised as a patient seeking emergency dental work. Michael unlocked the treatment room and stood looking at the chair where Petrov would sit in less than 2 hours. The overhead light already adjusted to the correct angle, the instruments laid out on the tray in their usual configuration, everything appearing exactly as it always had, except for the hidden cameras in the ceiling tiles recording his every movement. Petrov arrived at 2:04 p.m., 4 minutes later than scheduled, and apologized for the delay while explaining that traffic on Route 50 had been heavier than expected. He wore a dark overcoat and carried a leather briefcase that he set down beside the chair near the window before removing his coat and draping it in the same position where it had hung during every previous appointment. Michael shook his hand and felt the familiar firm grip of someone who had no reason to suspect that anything had changed, who trusted that this appointment would proceed exactly as all the others had proceeded over the past 3 years. Linda was already in the treatment room, arranging supplies. her movements controlled, but her eyes betraying the fear that had been building for weeks. And Michael could see Morrison through the open doorway, pretending to read a magazine in the waiting room, while actually monitoring everything that happened beyond her line of sight. Michael performed the cleaning with hands that felt steadier than they had any right to be, scraping away calculus deposits and polishing the tooth surfaces while Petrov lay back in the chair, with his mouth open and his eyes half closed in the resigned patience of someone enduring a procedure that was necessary but not particularly pleasant. They made small talk during the brief moments when Michael removed his instruments from Petrov's mouth to allow him to rinse and spit. Conversations about the cold weather and the upcoming presidential election, and whether the Redskins had any chance of repeating their Super Bowl victory from the previous year. The normalcy of these exchanges felt obscene, given what Michael knew and what the FBI cameras were recording, but he maintained his professional demeanor and gave no indication that this appointment was anything other than routine maintenance. 25 minutes into the cleaning, Michael noticed something that Morrison would later describe in her official report as the moment when operational security intersected with human instinct in ways that no amount of training could fully prepare agents to handle. Petrov's eyes, which had been half closed throughout most of the procedure, suddenly opened fully and focused on Michael's face with an intensity that suggested a shift in awareness had occurred. For approximately 3 seconds, Petrov stared at Michael while Michael continued working, and in that brief interval Michael felt certain that Petrov had somehow sensed the surveillance, had detected through some combination of observable details and trained intuition that the situation he found himself in was not what it appeared to be. But then Petrov's eyes closed again and his body relaxed back into the chair, and Michael understood that whatever suspicion might have flickered through Petrov's mind had been dismissed or suppressed or rationalized away by the weight of 3 years of routine appointments that had given him no reason to doubt Dr. Garrison's trustworthiness. Michael finished the cleaning at 2:29 p.m., removed his gloves, and told Petrov that everything looked good, that his oral hygiene remained excellent, and that they should schedule another cleaning in 6 months. Petrov nodded and began to sit up just as Morrison entered the treatment room from the waiting area, her FBI credentials already visible in her raised hand. Morrison identified herself as a federal agent and informed Viktor Petrov that he was under arrest for espionage against the United States. 2 additional agents who had been positioned outside the building entered through the back door and moved quickly to secure Petrov before he could react or attempt to flee. Petrov did not resist or argue or ask questions. He simply looked at Michael with an expression that contained neither surprise nor anger, but rather something closer to disappointment, the look of someone who had made a professional miscalculation and understood immediately the magnitude of its consequences. He said in accented but grammatically perfect English that Michael had been a good dentist, and then he switched to Russian and said something that the FBI translator would later render as, "We all have our duties to perform regardless of the cost to our souls." The agents placed handcuffs on Petrov and led him out through the back entrance to avoid the patients in the waiting room. But the attempt at discretion proved futile because several people had seen Morrison's credentials, and within hours the local news stations were reporting that an FBI arrest had occurred at a dental office in Arlington. By evening, Michael's practice had become the center of a media storm that would dominate local headlines for weeks. Reporters called his office and his home repeatedly requesting interviews. Patients called to cancel upcoming appointments, some expressing support for what Michael had done, but many more expressing discomfort with the idea that their dentist had been involved in counterintelligence operations. The American Dental Association opened an ethics investigation to determine whether Michael's actions had violated patient confidentiality standards, a process that would eventually clear him of wrongdoing, but which required him to testify at multiple hearings about his decision-making process and his understanding of his professional obligations. Petrov was arraigned in federal court in April 1984 and charged with multiple counts of espionage, unauthorized possession and transmission of classified information, and acting as an unregistered foreign agent. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and Michael was called to testify about how he had discovered the notebook on October 18th and how he had obtained the photographs during the November 3rd appointment. Sitting in the witness box describing those moments, Michael could see Petrov at the defense table listening without expression, and he wondered whether Petrov felt betrayed by what Michael had done or whether betrayal was simply an occupational hazard that intelligence officers learned to accept as part of the work they chose to do. The jury convicted Petrov on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison, though he would serve less than 3 years before being exchanged to the Soviet Union in 1986 as a part of a prisoner swap that also secured the release of several Americans being held on espionage charges in Moscow. The professional and personal costs of Michael's decision accumulated gradually over the years that followed. His dental practice never fully recovered from the publicity, and while some patients remained loyal and some new patients came specifically because they admired what he had done, the overall patient load declined by nearly 40% between 1984 and 1990. Linda left the practice in 1985, unable to overcome the anxiety that had developed during the months when she felt constantly under threat, and Michael never found another assistant who worked with the same intuitive efficiency that Linda had brought to the treatment room. His marriage to Sarah survived, but carried new tensions that had not existed before January 1984. Strains that manifested in arguments about decisions Michael made without consulting her, and in Sarah's periodic expressions of resentment about having been pulled into a situation she had never asked to be part of. His sons, David and James, faced harassment at school from classmates who called their father a snitch and who spread rumors that the Garrison family were government informants who couldn't be trusted with secrets. David developed anxiety severe enough to require therapy, and Michael watched his older son struggle through his final year of high school knowing that his own choices had contributed to that struggle in ways he could never fully repair. James became withdrawn and angry, spending more time alone in his room than with family. And while he eventually went to college and built a successful career as an engineer, his relationship with Michael remained distant and formal in ways that suggested forgiveness had been extended intellectually but not emotionally. Michael himself began drinking more heavily in the years after Petrov's arrest, using alcohol to quiet thoughts that would not stop circling through the same questions about duty and trust, and whether the intelligence value of capturing one Soviet spy could justify the personal costs that decision had imposed on everyone connected to it. He attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings starting in 1985 and managed to reduce his drinking to levels that no longer interfered with his ability to work, but he never achieved complete sobriety, and he never stopped using whiskey as a tool for managing the anxiety that had become a permanent feature of his internal landscape. He continued practicing dentistry until 2003, when he retired at age 62, selling his practice to a younger dentist who had no knowledge of what had occurred there nearly 20 years earlier. Sarah developed cardiovascular problems that her doctors attributed partly to stress, and she died in 2009 at age 66, leaving Michael alone in the house they had shared for 40 years. He moved to a smaller apartment in 2010, and his sons visited occasionally on holidays and birthdays, but the easy warmth that had characterized their family before 1983 never fully returned. In 2012, Michael received a letter from the FBI thanking him for his cooperation in an investigation that had helped prevent significant intelligence losses and had contributed to the eventual identification and disruption of a broader Soviet intelligence network operating in the Washington area during the 1980s. The letter was signed by the current director and contained language about patriotic service, and the difficult choices that ordinary citizens sometimes faced in extraordinary circumstances. Michael read the letter twice, and then filed it in a drawer with newspaper clippings from 1984, and the journal entries he had written during those months when he had been trying to decide what kind of man he was going to be. He was 77 years old in 2018 when he wrote the final entry in the journal he had been keeping since Korea, an entry that attempted to make sense of decisions made 35 years earlier and their consequences that had rippled forward through decades. He wrote that Viktor Petrov had been a spy, and that this fact remained true regardless of how much time passed or how much guilt Michael felt about the methods he had used to expose that truth. He wrote that Petrov had also been his patient, that in the dental chair Petrov had been vulnerable and trusting in ways that medical ethics were supposed to protect, and that Michael had chosen to weaponize that vulnerability in service of what he believed was a higher obligation. He wrote that he would make the same choice again if faced with identical circumstances, because allowing espionage to continue unchecked seemed clearly worse than violating one man's trust. But he also wrote that making the right choice had not prevented him from spending the rest of his life questioning whether he had actually made the right choice, or whether he had simply made the choice that felt necessary in the moment, and then spent decades constructing justifications that would allow him to live with what he had done. The root canal Michael had performed on Viktor Petrov in October 1983 had healed perfectly, the technical skill he brought to that procedure uncompromised by the moral dilemmas that would follow from what he discovered during it. Michael took some small comfort in knowing that he had done good dental work that day, that whatever else could be said about his actions, he had fulfilled his professional obligations with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his practice for 15 years. It was the work he had done afterward, the surveillance and the photography, and the cooperation with federal agents who transformed his office into a trap, that had never quite healed right, no matter how many years he spent probing the cavity it had left in his conscience. In the end, Michael Garrison had discovered that some betrayals were necessary, that duty sometimes demanded the violation of trust, and that being right did not always feel like victory. He had saved his country from a spy and lost something of himself in the process, and the mathematics of that trade would occupy his thoughts for the rest of his life, a calculation that never quite balanced no matter how many times he worked through the equation.